Hey everybody, it's Dr. Julie Quinn here, and I wanted to talk to you about one of the readings that we did not get a chance to talk about week 2, but that I wanted to give you some contextualization. I know we're not physically going to be meeting or going over this in a live class, but I wanted you to have some perspective on alternate points of view in relation to the 1619 Project. It's important to see that not everybody thinks the exact same way about history, and to remind everyone that history is interpreted based on data and information that's left behind. We don't have time machines, right? So there's no way that we know of in the present to go back in time other than to study old documents. You know, you can study the writings of historical peoples like Thomas Jefferson, James Monroe and others. We also have archaeologists who can do physical evaluations of artifacts. They can explore aspects of buildings and of home sites and things like that. And the materials that they gather gives us information about what happened at that time. But because, and of course, oral storytelling, information can be passed down through time, but like a game of telephone, the information that's passed down to us isn't always clear. And so the history that we learn in school is interpreted history by people who study documents and by people who study books and government materials and private diaries and all of this. And so the history we learn is an interpretation of an understanding of a certain time. And back when I was in school in the 70s and 80s, the predominant historians shared their information, published textbooks, and those are what we read. Now we're getting a lot more of different viewpoints about parts of history that are that should have more discussion taking place. And that's what the 1619 Project argument has been, is that instead of viewing, and again, it's a thought project. It's not like they're arguing or advocating for changing the birthday of the United States or anything like that. But what they're saying is, let's think about how other parts of American history have affected the American present, right? So the Nicole Hannah-Jones's introduction was something. I was like, what, about 10 pages that we read for week 2. And she juxtaposes her family's history. And if you go into it, we can certainly open that up. But she juxtaposes her family's history with, if we go into it, I'll show it to you. It was on it starts on page 14. So let me just do a quick refresher so I can give you the argument against. And you can kind of see them up against each other, and then you can make up your own minds. Nicole Hannah-Jones's argument was about how her dad was always really proud of the United States as a black man. She was confused as to why, because they lived in a red-lined area. Their neighborhoods were segregated. His family came from a very dangerous place in Mississippi, where there are more lynchings than anywhere else in the country. Her grandmother escaped the Jim Crow South with her son, Nicole Hannah-Jones's dad. They moved to Iowa. So we've got that. That's the frame. That's the introduction and conclusion. And in the middle of this is an argument about American history. And so you've got a chronological American history. Hannah-Jones talks about the settlements in Virginia, talks about the Revolutionary War, and she makes an interesting argument about how she believes that part of the fight with the British during the Revolutionary War, her argument through her study, she's a journalist, not a historian. So she studied historians' work, and she made an argument, like we study other people's work, and we're going to make an argument later on in our class. And she made the argument that the right to own slaves was one of the reasons, preeminent reasons why the United States tried to break away from Britain, because Britain was getting rid of slavery. And other historians will say, even in this Politico article, that she may not have gotten that part right. Okay? So look at this title for a second. This is from Politico magazine. It's labeled under the history department, so it's a history article, and it says, I helped fact check that 1619 Project, and the Times ignored me. Subtitle, the paper's series on slavery made avoidable mistakes. And so not all historians agree on Hannah-Jones's interpretation. And I don't want you to think that I'm trying to pass it off as if every historian agrees. There's a lot of debate about this, and we're going to sink our teeth into this debate. But I thought this article was really important because it's a historian's perspective and somebody who had access to the content. Our historian here, who is Leslie Harris, who is a professor of history at Northwestern University, and she's the author of In the Shadow of Slavery, African Americans in New York City, 1626 to 1863. And she also wrote Slavery in the Histories and Legacies. So an actual expert of the time period and of the topic, right? So instead of just having a political perspective, let's get a historical juxtaposition, and that's looking at it from another point of view. She says in her subtitle, the paper series on slavery made avoidable mistakes, but the attacks from its critics are much more dangerous. So if you look at that title there, she said, I told them that part about the Revolutionary War, that I didn't agree with their interpretation. And as you read this article, she'll explain the process and what happened. She said, on August 19th of last year, I listened in stunned silence as Nicole Hannah-Jones, a reporter from the New York Times, repeated an idea that I vigorously argued against with her fact-checker. The Patriots fought the American Revolution in large part, not entirely, but the majority of the reason was to preserve slavery in North America. Hannah-Jones and I were on Georgia Public Radio to discuss the project, a major feature about the impact of slavery in American history. The Times had just published it, and how it came about their name, and we already know that, so we can skim some of this. Weeks before, she said, I received an email from the New York Times research editor. Because I'm a historian of African American life and slavery, she wanted me to verify some statements about the project. And here's one statement that Dr. Harris, our historian, disagrees with. The one statement from the project that we read already was this: one critical reason the colonists declared their independence from Britain was because they wanted to protect the institution of slavery in the colonies, which had produced tremendous wealth. And at the time, there were growing calls to abolish slavery throughout the British Empire, which would have badly damaged the economies of both North and South. Dr. Harris said that she disputed the claim. Although slavery was an issue, the protection of slavery was not one of the main reasons. Maybe it was a minor reason, but she's giving qualifier words here. As academic readers, we need to pay attention. She's saying, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. That's that funny saying with, as you wash a baby, the water gets dirty. Of course, you're going to get rid of the dirty water, but you don't get rid of the baby with it. And so her main argument here was they got that Revolutionary War point wrong. But the rest of the project seems pretty valid. And that the editor worked with her. She answered all these questions, but she was dismayed to find out that they never changed the content. Despite my advice, they published and she says it's an incorrect statement. But again, she's arguing against Hannah-Jones's interpretation based on her own interpretation. And then she talks about the interesting data within the text. And she says, but wait a minute, most of what's in there, I think, is important discussion material. She says, overall, the 1619 Project is a much-needed corrective to the blindly celebratory histories that once dominated our understanding of the past, histories that wrongly suggested racism and slavery were not a central part of U.S. history. I was concerned that critics would use the overstated claim to discredit the undertaking, and that's what's happening. So if you search Google and you go into the news, you can see when former President Trump got together with some people within his administration and started the 1776 Project, and we've got these other projects, and people wanting to say, America's the greatest. And in class, we'll talk about this concept of American exceptionalism. And that's the idea that America arose under unique circumstances. And those unique circumstances created the quote-unquote melting pot of ideas and industry and people that we've got today. That tends to be sort of a very positive spin on historical action. And what Harris says here is the 1619 Project has become a lightning rod for critics because not everybody agrees with that sort of positivist spin. Okay? There's the Center for Debate about this. Even Hannah-Jones, after the publication now, you've already read her introduction. She acknowledged that she overstated her argument, and she plans to amend it in the book version. I have the book version, and I will share it with students. Anybody wants to come to my office hours that we don't meet physically, let me know, and you can read the chapters. You can see what's interesting. And what I have found in this text, in the book version, is that Hannah-Jones actually doubles down. At first, I think she made the statement of she overstated it to correct assumptions from or opinions from like Dr. Harris and others. However, she includes at least 11 other historians who say, wait a minute, no, this was a primary reason. And so even amongst historians, now, Hannah-Jones is a journalist, but amongst historians, there is not one particular view of history that everybody agrees on. So I think we need to be open to this idea that argument is interpretation, and we're building our writings to get to a place where we can write arguments of our own. But those texts aren't going to come without discussion and critical analysis and feedback. Harris is giving feedback to Hannah Jones, like I will give feedback to you. They don't fully agree on everything, but they agree that the project's an important one. Okay, you can see a planned 1620 project and all these other projects that are responses to 1619, that they're worried that the project is creating a chasm between black and white scholars, which I think is something that, if you're interested in history and you're interested in politics, could be a good exploratory topic for an upcoming paper. In the end of this, as you read all of this, and I would recommend you print it out and read it on a hard copy, the United States isn't like a monolith. There's not just sort of one opinion. And Harris says that the complicated picture was that white Southerners may have wanted to preserve slavery, but white Northerners were much more conflicted, with many opposing. So there was a debate of opinion. Harris says, far from being fought to preserve slavery, the Revolutionary War became a disruptor of slavery in the colonies. And if you think about the data about the English coming over and freeing slaves to fight on their side, and we've got that information there. As you go through this, we even have debates from Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison, prominent abolitionists, activists of their time, fighting against slavery and the value of the Constitution and how the Constitution represents. Is this a slavery document or is this an anti-slavery document? So there's a lot of really interesting history that's being contextualized here by Harris. And so this is an important viewpoint. Again, not every scholar is going to interpret history and agree with it the same way. I hope you explore this text. I hope it gives you insight that writers who interpret others' expertise may come up with opinions that are fresh and new and intriguing, but not all opinions are going to be created equally. And that's why we're going to take a look at the variety of opinions on these topics and explore our own in this class. So I hope you find this valuable. And if you have any questions, reach out and let me know.